get their drinks and walk to their seats, I will describe to you how I envision this working for the second stage. My job now gets easier and y'all's job gets harder. I am going to basically invite questions from the floor. And if you'd like to ask a question, stand or wave your arms or something, and I'll come around with the microphone, and I'll just have the you can ask a question of anyone you like, and I'll just ask the panelists to again be mindful of the time. We'd like to get enough questions in where people feel they've been able to participate. So I'm picturing us going until quarter till maybe 10 to 7, so that folks can get to the next thing at 7. So I see my friend Mike Angel with his hand in the air. I'm going to head over to him.
Thanks, Kyle, and thanks to all the panelists. My question I'm going to address to Micah, principally. I came a couple times to the General Assembly of Occupy DC. I was impressed by particularly the tactics of trying to come to consensus. I thought that was a really interesting way to have a meeting, and I was really impressed by that. I'm wondering about, we were downtown, I work at a church that's right downtown in DC, and when they cleaned up the camp for Occupy DC, we actually had to negotiate with police to be able to get a wedding in, because they had to cordon off blocks around Occupy DC because of how unsanitary the camp had become. I'm wondering, it's great to see that you all are still active. I'm wondering your thoughts about the closing of the camp at McPherson Square, what that was like, and what it's like to be in the movement since it's no longer in camp. Thanks.
So I was there when the camp was just first getting off the ground, and I remember I don't remember what the question was, but I remember telling several different reporters at the time, we haven't gotten the exit strategy, and it's kind of tragic actually how true that was. I felt like the encampment in McPherson Square was really productive and important for maybe about a month, 3 weeks for sure, maybe about a month. But we reached a certain tipping point where folks who were really there for the movement started withdrawing as more folks who were there either because they had no other place to go and had like serious we needed some folks who would deal with serious psychological and material needs that we didn't know how to deal with. So we had folks coming in who had those kind of needs that we didn't know how to deal with, and we also had folks who were coming in who were sort of there for the scene, like it was a concert or a party rather than a movement for social justice. So at a certain point, maybe at about a month, it felt like for me, I felt like I really didn't have much business being there anymore. It reached a certain tipping point where it didn't feel like it was about the movement anymore. And so it was several months after that the park was actually cleared out. And I know, some of my friends were still really involved with the camp and still, were concerned to reform it and, bring it back to its former glory. I had written it off, and I was really relieved when the camp was cleared was it in January? Yeah. So I was hoping that it would be cleared for quite a while before that. If I could have had it go the way I would have wanted it to go, we would have been there, say, for all of October, and then on November 1st, we would have declared victory, said we have used this tactic of encampment successfully, and now we're going to go do something else, which is in effect what has happened at this point. The Occupy movement is not centered in encampments, but instead is taking place in offices and schools and homes all over the city and forming new grassroots and, as my friend here said, horizontally governed organizations. One little thing about the consensus process I'd like to talk about. For me as a Quaker, watching the consensus process play out in the Occupy movement has been really interesting because friends, our manner of decision making among friends is a little bit different from consensus process, and we're, but there are a lot of similarities too. Friends, to make our decision making, gather together as the whole congregation and wait on our sense of the Spirit's moving, and out of that place of discernment and listening, determine together how God is leading us as a community. And when we're at our best, it's not only effective, but it leaves us really unified as a group and having a sense of we didn't just make this decision. This is God's will. And so that's really powerful for us as a community. And I really hoped that something like that would happen with Occupy. And there have been times when something like that has sort of emerged. It's been beautiful to watch. But often it's merely been human consensus. And well, what can we all agree on? What's the lowest common denominator that we can all agree on? So for me, coming from the background I come from, I continue to hope that we will discover ways to, regardless of our ideologies or beliefs about God, the way I described it when I was trying to move us more in that direction at McPherson was, I said, we're trying to listen for deep truth that we can all sense. And if we can listen to this truth together, we're going to be led to decisions that none of us is capable of making on our own, but which is going to empower all of us and move us in a good direction.
Thank you, Micah. Thank you, Mike. Another question? Oh, this is way more fun.
I guess my question is for you, Bishop. One of the things that kind of has been disturbing me, and not just about the Occupy movement, there are a lot of things to love about the Occupy movement, but one of the things that I kind of struggle with the Occupy movement and any kind of really protest movement that happens recently is there seems to be not a really clear line between reacting and responding. And I think especially as a Christian community, we're called to respond and not react. And so how do you see that playing out? And especially in your action, how do you see that as kind of a response to what's happening as opposed to reaction?
What is your first name?
Chris.
Chris, that's a very good question, and I want to echo what Micah said. I think Brooke and I, when we go, and I'm addressing when we go to a General Assembly meeting. How many of you have been to a General Assembly meeting? I encourage you to go, and then promise me you don't tear your hair out after you go, because it's a consensus model where you get on stack, but there's no place where you get to open space. In the art show today, a poem was read about feeling an elephant, and one of the spokesperson the poet was reading as if she was, I'm paraphrasing, was the voice of one of the blind men feeling the elephant. You know how that metaphor works. You get 5 or 6 people without sight, I don't like that expression, blind persons, sightless people touching an elephant, and they all feel different parts of it, and despite the fractured metaphor here, the greater truth of the poet was, that was one of the person doing the perception, sorry for this labored example, he said, I perceive there's a greater reality here than I can feel, I can sense. And so we all ask for that in the Occupy movement. It is reactive in the sense that stack is sort of a line of conversation. It's not reactive in that sense. It's labored and focused in that sense. I think, and this responds a little bit to what Mike was saying before in the question about liturgy, the liturgy of the streets, and what Marissa has written about. The liturgy of the streets for us as Episcopalians, we love liturgy. When I was at General Seminary, they were all over me about what's the liturgical aspect of this. Well, the liturgical aspect is that we act. Carney Ross talks about that in his middle chapters, Leaderless Revolution. We act. In other words, acting has its own kind of valence, its own importance here. So I respect so much that when Jim is asked a question about what Trinity does, they do this panel, they do this panel, they do this panel, they do this program. What Occupy does is it acts. It acts because it perceives reality differently. And I take issue with both Barney and Jim. I didn't realize that I would feel this way. They're both describing an environment that is housed and self-contained. You know, it is our property. We receive the rent. You're on our property. You're violating the law. As Chris Hedges says, that's what we do now. We defer to the law. to keep all things in place and in order. But the larger questions still stare at us. Of course, the seminary has responsibilities to its sister institutions. Of course it does. But it has responsibilities to all of the donors and this closed system, you see. And all of that is changing. So, in terms of what happened on December 17th, it happened over a series of many meetings. I felt that there was a larger issue at stake here, and I felt that there was an injustice that needed to be confronted, and that indeed I hoped that Trinity would allow other conversations to inform their sense of mission rather than this closed environment that was presented to us.
Again, I think it's fair to open things up further if Father Cooper or Barney, if you'd like to say something.
Trinity has deep relations with two parts of Occupy Wall Street. I think it's presented as if it's monolithic, but when you talk about a leadership movement, it's more of an amoeba, and as any healthy organization, I think, is. Our first relationship was with the Healthy Encampment, where my wife and I and many parishioners, and Emily, who was here early, would go every day, have conversation, be engaged. We'd meet folks like Micah, and bring food, celebrate, sing, carefully with a few, pray, not to intrude on others. But then that site, as he described, same in New York, had some unintended consequences, and that was those who gathered who were homeless in large numbers, those who had mental incapacities, those who had drug addictions, those who had mischief on their mind. And as Micah said, like here in New York, they were not geared to deal with that. Trinity was. And so we embraced that part of the population as best we could with other partners to try to address it. Some of those things that Trinity did was to train chaplains, to make our buildings available to every single Occupy Wall Street entity. Spokes Assembly, the medical teams were trained with us. The women who felt they'd been abused in some fashion had meeting rooms with us. So all of our buildings were available as it is to any part of the community. The second piece was to deal with the community as a whole, which would be our congregation, our neighbors, the merchants, the street vendors, and by the second and third month, they were losing business. They were frantic about the safety, people going back, whether this is paranoid or not. The truth is they were frantic and fearful. It was not a happy situation, and the encampment had its time, and most are grateful that it had concluded.
Okay, I have another question.
Forgive me for stating the obvious, but I'm noticing that all four of our panelists are men. And I'm thinking that not everyone who goes through a home foreclosure is male, and not everybody who's participated in the Occupy movement is male. And I would just welcome some conversation about the gender implications of your experiences from whatever side of this you are viewing it, and what good word you might have to say about the situation of women affected by the matters of concern.
I think economically women, and particularly head of household women, are at the greatest risk in the economic collapse and are the most vulnerable, they have the least control of their lives, they have the least control in those institutions that are ruining their lives. And that's hurtful.
Brooke, what happened in Brooklyn, in the Bronx?
Well, there is an organization called O4O. It's related to what Micah does. There's also Women Occupy. There's a very active women's version of the movement. We tend to be more playful. If it's a street action and you want to, bring attention to something, because there's a place for that, as well as the hardcore foreclosure. We're going to put our bodies first, in front of and prevent people from losing their homes. But women do tend to be more playful. I can't remember some of the Bank of America actions that took place. There'll be some really funny stuff happening on May 1st. So women are very active. I think this probably reflects the church, and I am just a lay person, a term I really hate. It's like saying you're the help. But I'm part of the 20,000 people a year who have left the Episcopal Church. So I think it's more of a factor of the church that tends to respond to women in a PC way. Look, we've ordained someone, and then that's done. Thank you very much, and we'll use you on the altar guild. So this is probably just a leftover of the culture. This is just my opinion. I'm just a schmo on the street.
Let me just also say that the Occupy Faith movement group in New York City adopted, does this sound familiar, this anthropology that they felt was that all faiths could subscribe to, and that is respect the dignity of every human being. It was a variation of that. That sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? And they were concerned that within the conversations of Occupy, that there wasn't this respect for persons of color, and it was not populated by enough female leadership. And so there's been a big effort to do that. If you go to a lot of Occupy encampments now, it's white guys with college degrees who have got some ability with social media, and that's not acceptable. We have to find a way to reach out to labor and to really do what the best side of anarchism is, and that is to reach, not in the sense of overturning the government, but in terms of setting aside the usual approaches to power, and so that everyone can participate. This is a very good question, and it's something that we need to be even more transparent about.
I think the hope is that the movement has rekindled a love and desire for grassroots democracy, and that will include women. Of course, it's not democracy without.
I think one thing I would say really briefly is my observation was that, as you'll remember, I talked about a tipping point that happened in the camp, and as we reached that tipping point, women all disappeared. There was almost not a single woman in the camp. And it was because physical safety had diminished to a point where women have different security concerns than men. And that wasn't taken very seriously, and the security situation in the camps changed. And that really excluded women. So I think the shift to more controlled environments that we are in now is a lot better for women. And I see a lot of women taking leadership, which I'm glad for.
Most of the writers, the good writers, most of the writers in OccupyTheory.org are women. They're women writers. Hannah Pell, Sandy Nurse, Laura Gottesdiener. That's really where some really good thinking is coming from.
But I do think it's important, before we crown all the women as bearers of good justice issues, that most of the wealth in this country finally is controlled. At some point, there's some high instance of wealth being controlled by women. And because they do live longer, foundations we have found in our raising of money for this chapel, we have been meeting with women, not men. And so I think that the Occupy movement probably has some of the frustration that we don't always see on the front page as how women become involved, because it is not a clear, very simple issue sometimes. And it would have been nice to have had a woman on this stage, but I think, and I thank you, Joyce, for making that point, because it's an important one. But I also think the movement has not necessarily spoken to all women with the same voice.
I want to say, the real ache here, by the way, has Jabril emailed you yet, his question?
Can't access
Okay.
email.
Is really persons of color and people who are the working poor. That's really what we need to get connected here. Certainly women within that group, but that's the class, the group of folk that need to be mobilized. And I think after May 1st, you'll see it. I'm hoping you'll see the different profile.
What George is referring to is an email today from one of our students, and who I think his pain over this forum is real, because he's saying that there was much more publicity and much more interest, it seemed, in doing this than on the Trayvon Martin tragedy. And he was raising issues about how it is that we can be so concerned about the Occupy Wall Street movement and yet have somehow an inadequate outrage, if you will, or wanting to have a discussion of both sides of the issue of the curse of racism and all of the tragedy associated with a young man being killed in Florida, and how that has not necessarily galvanized, if you will, our seminary community and perhaps even the Episcopal Church. Is that a fair? I think most of you saw that email.
I mean, some would even say that we're preparing to minister to the 1% in some respects. I mean, you're going to be well educated in your clergy groups when you go to your towns and villages and cities, and I think that you want to be. I'm trying to be, feeling the fragility of that place. So when we go to a Occupy Faith meeting at the Universalist Church in New York, Rosemary is our convener. We have all kinds of folks from all walks of life, and Minister Malcolm from Brooklyn. We have a Wiccan minister there, and then there's a contingent that walks in from the Diocese of New York. So we're in this together. We have to kind of find a connection with each other horizontally.
Thank you. I'm mindful of our time. I want to allow one more question, and then I think we'll need to close, and we can do some individual follow-ups again, if and as the panel is willing. So I'm going to pass the microphone to Dorota.
Kyle, and thanks to everyone. Maybe this isn't an interesting final word. So I don't mean to overgeneralize those of us who are gathered here, but I would say the majority of us are MDiv students who are on our way to ordination, and ordained leadership in the Episcopal Church. Some of us may end up in DC or in New York, but many of us won't. And we will in various ways be caught in our own tension between institutional responsibility, financial responsibility, et cetera, and real mission in the church, and issues of justice within our own communities that I think are in many ways aligned with the Occupy movement, whether or not that has a very visible face in our communities. But I think that there's just a lot of wisdom that is important, and in many ways in tension in between some of what we've heard tonight. And I'm wondering what word you may have for those of us who are going to be in our own communities dealing with these tensions in our own ways.
Hinting at that early on in the conversation, that what in the world is God trying to accomplish? What skills do we, this given congregation, have to address it, and to understand you don't have all the skills, nor does Trinity Church, but to figure out what they are, what you can do best, and celebrate others. I'm glad he climbed over the fence. I'm glad I didn't. Both of those were dramatic responses to a horrific problem in our economy. Trinity's little round of deciding what it's good at is advocacy. The movement helped us in our advocacy in New York State to get with many others, to get education bill reversed. We have influence in regulation. We have influence in taxation issues, philanthropy, grassroots, through our communication systems. Look at the skills you have and apply them to the vision of ministry that you want to accomplish in changing the world. Don't plan to do it all. Celebrate those who do the other part.
I think if I were in your shoes, I'd be excited and a little scared, because I'm not sure that the Episcopal Church that you're being ordained to is going to be there much longer. It's going to be there in some way, but I don't know what it's going to be like. And to those who are wise, I think, would go into ministry and check out the emergent churches in your area. Not saying you want to throw in St. Bede's in the swamp in with the emergent churches, but at least get some sense of what's going on the streets. We talk about de-churched people, trying to get people back into the church. There are a lot of unchurched people, and those are the folks who are going to outlive everybody on this panel. Well, maybe not you. But you see, that's where we're going here. And Christ has not left us. Christ is still here. The truth of that, what I said in the sermon, is really true. The substance of Christ is still here in that Eucharist. That moment of mystery is transportable. And it doesn't always happen at that Wednesday service at 10 a.m. that you are dutifully have to commit to, suburban and city urban churches, and also on Sunday morning, of course. We just don't want to do, what's that great phrase that operates in New York now? Churches with floor shows, what is it?
There's a lot of walking museums with floor shows.
A lot of walking museums with floor shows. We're not trying to do that, and I know you're aware of that. You're on the edge of your seat, you're getting ready to move out there and roll up your sleeves and do ministry, and ministry's there. And it doesn't have to always be on the streets, but what I said about, being sensitive to the streets can also be Main Street. I mean, sometimes people kind of close in and keep private their lives away from you. And the only way you're going to get at them is to do those insistent, awful parish calls and, get in their faces and get in their lives. And that means getting into lots of different lives. And that's the bubble that we need to prick in the Episcopal Church here, because otherwise we wind up just being in this rarefied atmosphere. Yes, the ministry of the 1% is important, but the 99% are being worked over.
As a fellow minister who's not a part of the Episcopal Church, I would encourage seminarians to, as you complete seminary and as you become priests or other sorts of ministers in your communion, that you dare to question the assumptions that you're being given, that you're being born into as ministers, that you dare to question the assumptions that have been born of a long relationship with wealth and power. I believe that Scripture needs to be read contextually. I don't believe that Scripture is a rule book that we can just pull out and throw verses at people and win our arguments that way. But I do think it's very important for us as ministers in this time to be very aware of Jesus' command to the rich young ruler or to the rich young man, and see ourselves as the rich young man and hear Jesus' challenge to us and ask ourselves the question, what would happen if we gave it all away? What would happen if we let go? There's a story that I read when I was a child. It was from a set of Jewish stories or parables, and it's actually kind of a ridiculous set of stories about these weird creatures, and they're trying to take advantage of people in different ways. And I forget most of the stories, but one image I remember is there's one of the creatures. They're able to trap him because they set out a jar of pickles overnight, and when they come back, he's got his hand caught in the pickle jar because the pickles are so big and his hand is wrapped around them. He's all night he's been trying to get his hand out of the pickle jar, but he won't let go of the pickles. can we let go of the pickles?
Thank you for your question, Dorota. I think partly one of the gifts, I think, for people like me who have the opportunity to serve at Virginia Seminary is that we can really not assume that the Episcopal Church will not be a bright star in the future. It's a little too early to write the obituary of this church, and partly that's because of people like you who are followers of Jesus and who come out on a Friday night and are doing tonight what we're doing. So I am very encouraged, very positive about our church and the generous orthodoxy that I think it represents in American Christianity, and the importance of thoughtful people like you who are going to make a difference in this world. You asked, what should a priest be about? There are two things I would say. One, I would tell you some qualities that I think are important. And finally, I would tell you, sort of in using Micah as an inspiration, tell you of a story briefly that I think might help make you see why I'm optimistic about the future. I think you need three things as a priest in our church. One, you need the life of the mind, and you need to take it seriously. You need the life of faith, and that means how you walk with Jesus every day. You also need a life of practices. Those are three important things. The two other things that I would add is you need pure grit. And I mean by that guts as well as courage. And you also need a sense of humor. So those are important things, I think, as a priest that you need. What I would say that about the Episcopal Church and what you might be doing as a leader in the church, I would encourage you to read a little book that has meant a lot to me. It's a book by Morris West called The Clowns of God. And it's the story of the First World War, when the Germans were coming and a French town was worried about its future. And they didn't know quite how to keep the town from being burned. So finally they did something that was extraordinary. They realized that it really isn't left to the brightest and the best to guarantee the future and to anchor God's mission in the world. It's left to the weakest and the marginalized. So what they did was they emptied the asylum, all the handicapped and retarded people, and they put them in charge of the bakery and the post office and everything else. And all the normal people went into the asylum till the Germans went through town. And they were so disarmed by the hospitality, the kindness, and the love that they were undone. People were giving away bread. They were saying, come on, just choose some of this meal. This is yours. You can have it. It was just absolutely turning society upside down. And I do think that's part of what you're called to do, and to do it with gentleness and with out of a deep following of Jesus.
What? Final thought? Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have a quick last thing? I was going to dismiss us, but okay. So I would like to thank everyone who's come out tonight. I would like to thank once again our panelists for traveling here, for their time and their insight and generosity of spirit. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you to you all and to the folks we thanked at the beginning. It's been a great evening, and I appreciate your being here. So,
here's the Weston.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.